Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation, which is titled South African Democracy, a Critical Review. This is hosted by the Center for the Advancement of Center of Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, in partnership with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. So this forms part of the democracy series, and this is actually the last one for the year. So I'm hoping that I will close it off with a bang. So my name is Uzola Mwambusi. I work in the non-profit sector, particularly in education. I'd like to thank you, Konrad, UKAS, and the institution for allowing this opportunity for us to have such conversations, which are actually important. So just as an opening, the government is actually obligated to act in the interest of the citizens, because literally they are financed and employed by the citizens. And so the title really suggests that, so it asks, how South Africa has transitioned to democracy. And one of the questions that pop up in my head is really if South Africa has transitioned to democracy, or are we still in the process, or have we not moved at all? And some questions as well that come up is what democracy looks like. What is it as an idea? What was it as an idea? And what is it as an ideal as well? And you'll find there are some questions that have popped up in today's where people, like for instance, Sizwe Walsh has argued that apartheid did not die, but it was actually advertised. So we're going to let the speakers take us through and navigate some of those questions. I'm going to start with Sis Zandi, who I'm going to quickly introduce as I read her bio. So Sis Zandi is a Pan-Africanist and a Black consciousness activist. She's also a decolonial scholar who teaches political sciences at the University of South Africa. She holds a master's degree from the university currently known as Rhodes. So that is short for UCKAR. Quick house rules before I just hand over to Susani. Can you please all keep our microphones off, our microphones muted, and our cameras off as well. But Susani, please keep yours on. Thank you so much. Over to you, Susani.
Thank you, Zolani. Colleagues, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Audible. You may proceed.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Mulwen Nonke. I am quite honored to be part of this critical conversation. I think it is quite timely, and it comes at a very important time in the history of our democracy. And I think it occasions a very, very critical and unapologetic reflection. And I'm glad to see that, the organizers have tried to bring together a divergence of, views, especially consisting of young people and women. Zola, I don't know if you mind, but I prefer keeping my camera off as I go through my presentation. I hope that's okay with everyone. At least you've seen my face, and I'd appreciate your understanding. So the topic presented with us today does not in any way for me not inspire an alternative reading that for me comes from the Black consciousness perspective. And I chose to title my brief conversation as Decolonizing the Rainbow, Mandela and the Making of the Non-White Slave in Post-1994 South Africa. we in the Black Consciousness Pan-Africanist School of Thought do not refer to the democratization process in South Africa as post-apartheid, like most people do. Instead, we insist that it is post-1994, which speaks to the, aborted mission of revolution, decolonization in South Africa. I'd also like to dedicate this brief talk or conversation to the Black Consciousness movement, particularly since this year marks the 45th year anniversary of the blending of the Black Consciousness movement and its organizations, including newspapers that were, existing in the time and were very useful in helping the organization to build critical consciousness in the community. Of course, the banning of the Black Consciousness movement came a month later after Steve Biko's brutal death at the hands of the South African police, a death which occurred during his detention. And the banning also came a year later after the 1976 Soweto uprising in June 16, and after the murder of one of the Black Consciousness leaders whom is erased today, Mapetla Mohafi, in August 4th of 1976, who too died in the hands of the police. It is undeniable, therefore, that between 1976 and 1977, the impact and the success of the organizing principle and the philosophy of Black consciousness, which is self-reliance, self-determination, and psychological liberation, had reached its peak. I think that moment marks a very, very important memorial for South Africans living in the post-1994 context. The title of my talk is partly inspired by a reading that I stumbled across, a poem or collection of poems written by J.J.R.L. Jolobe. And this particular poem is titled The Making of a Servant. And I just want to quickly read a few lines from the poem before I just go into my brief talk. He says, and I open in quotations, "I can no longer ask how it feels to be choked by a yoke, a rope, because I have seen it for myself in the chained ox. The blindness has left my eyes. I have become aware. I have seen the making of a servant in the young ox," close quotes. To start off my conversation, I think the topic of the conversation, or rather what I decided to title my conversation, is inspired by this lyrical depiction of, the making of a slave. And this poem was written in the 1970s, in the peak of apartheid. And it paints a picture of, how the system was able to tame and make people submit, to its whims, and thereby creating from human beings, an entity of a servant. So one would cease to be a human being in totality and become a servant, for the system, much like how the ox becomes, is tamed to become a servant to its owner. To decolonize the idea of the Rainbow Nation from an epistemological perspective means bringing into focus other readings or alternative readings of the 1994 moment, and ask whether this moment represents decolonization or the abortion thereof. One of the most famous and prophetic chapters of Frantz Fanon's Wretches of the Earth talks about, the pitfalls of national consciousness, or the misadventures of national consciousness. In this chapter, it would seem that Frantz Fanon is giving, a warning to South Africa, who is the last African state at the time to be liberated from the clutches of apartheid and colonialism. He seems to be saying that, South Africa needs to take caution in terms of how it would try to avoid the pitfalls of national consciousness in the that have befallen all post-independent African states. So in a way, this chapter is pointing to some of the things that consequently South Africa would come to experience in the post-1994 moment. In fact, almost the entire diagnosis of that Frantz Fanon makes about post-independent African states in that chapter applies with stunning exactness to post-apartheid or post-1994 South Africa, precisely because Frantz Fanon observes that the national bourgeoisie or the elite class is incapable of learning from its lesson. The post-1994 moment, from a perspective of what is known as the Azanian school of thought, represents a compromise that is built onto the dispossession of the Black majority by the elite class in service of white supremacy and white interest. This is what the Black consciousness philosopher Mabogo More, who also writes on this phenomenon or notion of aborted decolonization, evoking Frantz Fanon, this is what he calls, the option of, opting for flag liberation instead of decolonization. And he attests, this to the idea of freedom that comes about with the mercy of the colonizer for the colonized. In other words, it was the colonizer who decided that, look, perhaps we ought to grant the colonized its liberation, and then went on to further, prescribed the various methods under which that freedom would be achieved. In the context of South Africa, of course, we know that one of the most contested liberation method is the South African Constitution, under which many have argued, sustains coloniality or colonization or apartheid instead of trying to, end it or grapple with it differently. It is in this context that the Black conscious movement and many people who write from what we call the Azanian school of thought have called the South African Constitution a means of sustaining the land dispossession question, particular through constitutional means. In other words, land dispossession continues through, constitutional means. In other words, it is constituted, it is legal, and therefore sustained in the democratic context. I don't know if I want to leave it there and perhaps allow, others to come in before I can expand or hear what the House thinks.
Thanks, Zandi. You still have about 6 minutes left, so you may continue if you want to, but we'll allow questions and responses from the audience when the last speaker has spoken.
I'm happy with allowing conversations instead of, being the solo presenter. So let's hear what others have to say. And if there's time, I can engage in the Q&A moment.
All right, thank you so much, Sandy. Okay, so yes, so Sandy spoke from the Azanian school of thought, specifically as well as Black consciousness. We're going to allow the second speaker to step in, which is Uceliwe Shivambu. Uceliwe comes from the Defend Our Democracy campaign. So Uceliwe, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope I'm audible. Thank you so much, Zola, and thank you so much for the invite to come and engage with the House this afternoon. And again, thanks to the first speaker for starting us off. Really looking forward to the discussion when it comes to the Q&A. As Zola has mentioned, my name is Uceliwe Shivambu, and I'm from the Defend Our Democracy campaign. The Defend Our Democracy campaign is a campaign that basically started off with the idea, or the vision rather, to have people as the last line of defense. And this came after, a lot of destabilization in the country, in government, in parliament, in chapter 9 institutions, and just a lot of chaos, and with just a lot of aims to try and destabilize democracy. We recently had the Conference for Democratic Renewal and Change. And this conference basically wanted to bring about a fundamental shift in our politics, right? Trying to make sure that our politics are people-centered and that the interest of the people are put first, right? And of course, that was, just the definition, or rather the idea of democracy. It was to ensure that even the leaders we elect to put the interest of their constituency before. But since then, we have seen that there's been a shift where there's been people in our government, in all of these democratic institutions benefiting themselves and those around them, right? And of course, we can just, go on about, state capture. We can go on about corruption in our institutions. But today, I really just want to focus on the people, right? The people that make this democracy, the people that shape this democracy. And where are they in the picture, or rather in the big idea of what democracy is today? And as a young person, born in 1999 in this country, never have, experienced the anti-apartheid movement, or been part of it, but just hearing stories of the freedom that was attained, and the cost that was paid for this freedom, you would automatically assume that we would benefit from it, right? And that the people would then have the power, as what the anti-apartheid movement was about, was to, give people power, whether it's power for people to go to the voting stations, or to even elect the people that they would want to represent them. And there's been a huge shift in that. So what has happened since the transition to democracy in this country is that we've seen people move further and further away from the polls, right? These are like your voting stations, right? And of course, we can speak about the many reasons for it. But most importantly, I'd like to view it as a political decision, right? There's just always this mindset going around that people not voting is because of lack of voter education, right? But I would like to believe, in my personal capacity, that people know the power of voting, and people understood what voting meant for the people that have came before them and what it means for them. And them not going to the polling station then becomes their own political stance, or political decision rather, and not a case of political education. And several cases have influenced this decision for people to back away from even wanting to participate in democracy, right? And that's because of the accountability, or the lack of accountability and transparency from their elected representatives, because of the socioeconomic issues that people would then sometimes face, unemployment for the young people, the high crimes in communities, lack of service delivery, and just not having hope anymore in what whichever party they vote for is going to bring about, right? And as the defender of democracy, then right now, what's currently happening in this country is the electoral amendment bill that is currently at the NCOP, right? And what a civil society we're basically saying is that in order for us to get people back into participating in electing their leader or in the politics of it, people need to be able to vote for their MP, right? They need to be able to vote for their own representatives. And we do believe that most of the MPs who voted last week voted without engaging on how, you know, this electoral amendment bill will negatively impact the electorate and of course steal the vote and also affect the 2024 election. And electoral reform then becomes about holding elected representatives more accountable. And because now these elected representatives then become accountable to their political parties, right? They not accountable, but they become loyal to their political parties and the people that voted them into power. And we see that with, you know, the coalition governments not working because all the political parties are just focused on just themselves, and party loyalty are not really the people that elected them to be there. So of course there's just this mood going around that coalition governments aren't working. And we then have to question if you know, it's more important being in power or serving your people, right? There hasn't been any that has come up and be like, this is about serving the people, but it's more about who sits in the, you know, in the seat of power, especially in our metros. So what does that mean, right, for transitioning democracy that I currently live in and where we currently live in? It then means that we need a more active citizenry, right? And by that, we basically mean that politics cannot be, and that's, you know, politics with the capital P, cannot really be left to politicians alone, right? We need young people, marginalized communities to get involved in the politics with the small p. And that could basically mean attending a public rally in your community that is hosted by, you know, civil society. It could even mean attending this session alone. It makes you an active citizenry and you practicing your civic duty, right? If your local you know, councillor is holding a community meeting, it means attending those, right? And as someone who has worked in civil society for like just a little over a year, in organizing and convening civil societies and communities and grassroots communities, you then see the huge divide when you need to fill up a room to basically speak about fundamental issues that affect people, such as electoral reform, such as, you know, the water crisis, the electricity crisis, and even, you know, new holding leaders accountable. You then see that lack of attendance from community members, or them just really focusing on other things that that becomes their day-to-day, you know, challenges, and not really drawing up the picture to, oh, how is the electoral amendment bill being passed in the NCOP affecting my day-to-day? And again, I mean, there's also like a huge role that civil society needs to play in drawing up that picture and making it very clear, and making that the linkages very clear, that the cost of bread does link to who your MP is, or who your president is, or who, it does link to that. So it's just trying to paint a picture, give the material conditions of everyday South Africans not having access to clean water, not having electricity, leaving this meeting and going to like load shedding or water shedding or petrol shedding. Those material conditions do link with who is in power and who participates in those in those politics and who participates in that democracy. And at a local, level, we definitely need to be engaged, and that means, attending those council sittings, monitoring and just probing some of the budgets in your local municipality. And at a national level, of course, is just having the opportunity to engage, through the electoral reform and with MPs who then want to protect their own interest, by then saying that, people are demanding an electoral system that allows for greater accountability. So that means exposing those MPs and then saying that politics, or rather being a public representative, is not just only about your interest alone, but it's the interest of, your communities. And, I hope that just draws up the bigger picture of how many decisions are being made every day in, our democratic institutions that affect our material conditions, and as a result then affect this transition to democracy, or rather the idea or the ideal democracy, and then requires the everyday person in South Africa to engage in those issues and to realize how who you vote into power then does affect your material conditions and your everyday to-day living. And I think that's what, as the Defender of Democracy aim to do, is to ensure that people are the last line of defense, and that people can say, no, don't steal my vote, or I want to vote for my own MP, or I want to decide who my representative is. It's taking back that power to the people, so that democracy, in the equation of making democracy, the people are central to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Liwe. Yeah, so she just mentioned that people actually know what voting means, and there's been a lack of accountability from our political leaders, and a lack of service delivery as well. And that has resulted in people losing hope in the political leaders. And instead, another thing that has actually happened is political leaders being loyal to their parties, as opposed to the electorate that actually puts them in office. So thank you so much for your contributions, Esteliwe. Colleagues, just a quick one. Please feel free to engage on the chat box here and ask questions, and then we'll read the questions when the last speaker has just spoken. Yes, so now I'm going to introduce the last speaker, who's Sam Bainan. Sam holds a Bachelor of Administration degree in Public Administration and Political Science, and a Bachelor of Arts Honors degree in Political Science from the Nelson Mandela University. She served as the Secretary General and Deputy President of the SRC at the Nelson Mandela University. She's an AB Bailey Foundation and graduate of the Forte Autumn School on Social Democracy and Political Economy. She's traveled abroad to represent South Africa in several international youth engagements, such as in Germany and in Russia and India for BRICS Youth. Sam, over to you.
I just want to check if I'm audible. Hi, everyone.
You're audible. Thank you, Sam.
Awesome. Thank you, Zola. So like Susandi, I also prefer to present with my video off. I hope that preference can be accommodated, Zola. So yes, thank you to everyone for the platform and the opportunity to engage today. I'm incredibly excited to hear from everyone on the platform and most certainly look forward to the A&Q session after I've given my inputs, and of course have already enjoyed hearing from Usisandi and Ucediwe in terms of some of the thought-provoking inputs they've already shared. I have a lot of questions myself for them. But I think for myself, when reflecting on the specific topic for discussion, I think the first thing for me is that, particularly because I wear several hats, both historically and contextually, I went back and reflected on my time as a young public representative who contested local government elections and was elected to serve as a local government councillor in the previous set of elections. I started to think quite critically about some of the pieces of legislation, some of the day-to-day institutional cultural practices within some of our legislative houses that continue to persist post-1994, and that specific moment, as well as how, rightfully so, Usiseli has spoken about citizenry and the need for citizens to be actively engaged. The first thing that came to mind was that I'm of the view that although the Constitution was a breakthrough, I believe personally that it hardly has represented the moment at which liberation has descended from the heavens for all South Africans, in particular Black South Africans, Black women South Africans, people living with disabilities, members of the LGBT community, and so forth, because I try my best to always be intersectional in thinking and in approach to some of these questions. And I think that for me had me thinking about by whom was this Constitution drafted and for whom was this Constitution drafted. Yes, I think that to a certain degree, it can be argued that things are, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, perhaps my video should have been on for that specific purpose, but in quotation marks, are better somewhat to some degree than pre the 1994 moment. But in many other cases, and with respect to a number of issues facing many South Africans on a daily basis, we know that there hasn't been much change. And I think that part of the reason, because there are different reasons as to why, what informs that reality, but I think part of the reason does lie with that moment into the transition, the negotiation table, and some of the discussions that were had at that moment. And it begged this question around the Constitution, around its contents, and its ability to truly transform South Africa, particularly economically and socially. And it then led me to think about a second question around whether or not it is possible for the same organization to be an instrument of liberation at one time, but then at another time be the same instrument of oppression. And of course, by no means am I suggesting that there was a single entity or single organization that led us to that transitional moment, because we know that in any discussion, history, context, and culture matters. And we know that sadly, in our reflections, history hasn't always been documented, hasn't always been archived, and certainly hasn't always been relayed to us as young people in its fullness. It's involved the erasure of many entities, specifically citizen-led entities outside of the ANC, specifically Black women's voices and contributions during the time of liberation. But if we were to center it down to a single organization that currently rules us, the question then begs to ask, were we liberated at one time and now oppressed at another? And what does that mean for us as citizens? And just to expand a little bit more on that question, if we consider, as mentioned before, our electrical system or electoral system, hey, I must have load shedding on my mind. We know that it is comprised of political parties who contest, national, provincial, and local government elections, and who represent us, or who are at least in principle mandated to represent us in our respective legislative houses, be it with a full majority or in the form of a coalition, as we tend to see in some of our cities and some of our hung municipalities across the country. We know for a fact that they are funded and that those funders give them a particular mandate to deliver. And I think that that would be a third question I have when we consider the discussion, topic today, as to, does that mandate from donors to political parties? Because I'm raising this in the context that I think many a time we turn to our politicians, our political leaders, and say, well, at the end of the day, it is you who is leading us in society. It is you who governs us. It is you who passes laws. It is you who is mandated by the Constitution to carry out oversight. And we at times tend to forget that those politicians arguably are but faces of a much broader, widespread project, both here and abroad, to control this country and to fund a specific mandate that doesn't necessarily speak to socioeconomic transformation, so that the majority of citizens in our country can live far better lives. And so I think that in terms of the moment, critically analyzing the transition moment is something for us to think about. Just going back to some of the question of pieces of legislation that affect us every day, if we're to think about the Constitution, and consider whether or not, as just one example of many, the extent that the role of customary law and traditional leadership in terms of governing our country, the extent to which it can, we see that it's very limited. Because even though the Constitution guarantees the right to culture, the practice of which is intricately linked, at least in as far as the majority of South Africans, to recognition of and respect for some form of traditional leadership system, we see that pieces and texts within the Constitution don't actually allow for customary law and our traditional leaders to practically lead to the extent that they should rightfully have been able to from the get-go. So the point I'm trying to make is that as Africans or South Africans, in our own country, we see our own system of holding citizens to be held accountable for their actions, to govern and lead, being superseded by and subservient to a Eurocentric system of governance and a Eurocentric justice system. Also briefly wanted to speak about the question of where economic power lies. it is a reality that economic power resides outside of the South African state, and it resides in the hands of private and unaccountable enterprises. And this speaks to the question around land and other means of production, the ownership and distribution thereof. What does it mean that 20 or 30 odd years later, from that transitional period or moment, the majority of South Africans, in particular Black South Africans, still do not own the land, still do not own the means of production? Second, lastly, I wanted to speak a little bit about the question around how, in terms of public policy, there has been a large focus around dealing with the question of Black disadvantage, but at the same time, not necessarily dealing with the reality of white advantage. And the reality of the matter is that if we were to consider the question of economic privilege as it stands, both in that transitionary period and again today, we'd see that white South Africans in particular, and for the most part, have fewer economic dependence. They have greater access to transgenerational savings, greater access to socioeconomic support systems like old boy networks and wealthy family members, and the benefit of several generations of proximity to geographical economic centers. And so this myth that we've inherited around the fact that things, again in quotation marks, are better than they were before because, for example, more Black South Africans have, for example, access to good education, or perhaps earn more in terms of income, the income having been raised. We, yes, may have accounted for Black disadvantage to a certain degree, but that still does not mean we have accounted for unwarranted and unjust white advantage. And I think that that is also something that we would need to explore. And lastly, just to expand a little bit, or also to speak to the question of active citizenry, I think it's important to contextualize that at the transitionary moment, and even now, 20 to 30 odd years later, we still have inherited legislative houses that are Eurocentric in nature, and that by their very makeup in their genetics do not allow for equal and fair, just accessibility to marginalized South Africans to participate in lawmaking oversight processes. So when we talk about the need for citizens to become more active and to participate in lawmaking, to participate in oversight processes, we need to be cognizant of the fact that many a time these processes are not made available. So if you, in a more practical sense, would think about something like an annual IDP, integrated development plan, and budget process within a municipality, you'd have to ask yourself, let's use Nelson Mandela Bay Metro as an example. We'd have to ask ourselves if Uma from Motherwell in NU30, okanye ubuti kwanobuhle, okanye one of our sisters based in the northern areas would be able to access an IDB and budget process where they stay, when, for example, we have politicians and public officials who, it can be argued whether or not, it's deliberate or intentional, but who systematically on a year-to-year basis create public participation programs that are not accessible, in that they are not geographically accessible, in that they don't close the rural-urban divide gap, they don't speak to the technological divide, unequal divide in our communities, and don't allow for citizens to participate in the way, the language, the time, the space, the cultural practice that they want to. I've always been of the view that people and social movements must be able to shape their participation and shape their struggle in the way that they want to, in their own language, in the space and the time that they want to, and that there shouldn't be somewhat of a bureaucratic and of course still Eurocentric, because the system hasn't been decolonized, way and place and space and time. So those are some of my inputs around this question. They touch on different areas. But yeah, those are my inputs, and looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, for your contribution. Yeah, so Sam just touched on a couple of points, which included, well, she actually first questioned who the Constitution was drafted for and who actually drafted it, and mentioned that we highlighting the importance of recording history, as well as being able to relay to young people. And then she also spoke about, well, phrased it in a question where, in terms of who the economic power lies in South Africa. So, and citing things like land ownership. And then she also spoke about white advantage. So, whereby white South Africans have less economic dependency and better networks and so on. So thank you so much, Sam, and to Sisandi and Beliwe for the contributions. We're now going to jump over and start reading the questions that come, and then each speaker can, actually, the audience can actually ask any speaker, or they can actually ask all three, and then we'll just keep on reading questions and allow the speakers to respond. Sure. So I'm going to read one that was just sent by Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. So she says, "Thank you to the speaker. These are indeed interesting provocations, but I have always had an issue with the ostensibly universal nature of political rights in liberal democracies. Citizenship and rights only matter to those who can enforce them. Buried deep in the heart of liberalism are racial and gender configured pivotal concepts. Although constitutionally all individual citizens are equal and have equal rights and are fundamentally the same in reality, not all humans within society are treated as individuals. I really think that there is insufficient appreciation that for one to have equal rights, they need to be equal socially. Ultimately, the fact is that women are not socially equal in the patriarchal system, and the law cannot change that. My question then is it a possibility in our lifetime to imagine an African-based epistemological intervention that will work for Africans as a way to move away to this individualized, inhumane framework?" Thank you so much, Kama, for the question. Marco, please let us know if there are any questions that are also coming through from YouTube and our Facebook page. But in the meantime, I'm going to allow the speakers to respond to Kama's question. So, Suzandi, do you want to go first? Hi, Suzandi, can you hear me? Okay. Cecilia, would you like to go while we establish if Suzandi will can hear us?
Thank you, Zola. I don't really. Okay, go ahead, Suzandi.
So it's scheduled for load shedding in our area, and the network takes about 10 minutes to resume. So I think I'll be able to join you in exactly 10 minutes. So Beliwe, you can go ahead. Thanks.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Zola. I don't know if I think it's Kawe that's asking the question. Kama, sorry. Yeah, and I'm not sure I really understand it, and I'm just trying to like read it here. I don't know if maybe she can come in and just explain the question. Thank you.
Sure, Kama, do you want to come in and ask your question?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you to the speakers. These were very interesting interventions, and thank you for the platform. But really, my question really centers around the fact that, you know, in liberal democracies, there's a million reasons why democracy, you know, it has its challenges throughout the continent, and there are many ways that it doesn't work. But particularly from a gendered perspective, we are not all equal in the society, and it just really circles around that. So how is it possible then that the constitution can say that all individual citizens are equal, whereas women, particularly Black women, are not equal socially in the society? How can we reconcile those two things? But ultimately, moving away from Western epistemologies of democracy and the whole idea of liberalism, I'm asking if it is possible to imagine an African-centered intervention that will work in the future. I do understand that, you know, I think we still are in transition. It's not going to happen tomorrow or next year. But I'm just really trying to tease out the imagination of, is it possible in our lifetime as the young people of this country to imagine an African-centered framework that will work for us? Because liberal democracy, it has its own, you know, issues, and there are many. Thanks.
Thanks, Kama. Skulu, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question, Kama. So I'm a climate just activist, and I want to answer that question, maybe borrowing from that school, and say that, you know, it is important that there is a just transition, right? In climate change, that's what we're currently grappling with, especially in the African, you know, continent, with the developing versus the developed countries, with them having to pay up for loss and damage, you know, of the damages that we're, you know, that they cost in the developing areas. And the idea of the just transition is that if we're going to be moving away from coal, and please just follow my line of thought, if we're going to be moving away from coal into green or renewable energy, there are workers, for example, in Mpumalanga, Malahleni, who work in coal factories or plants, and their families and communities have been so dependent on that, and therefore transitioning into renewable energy that will wipe away that coal plant means that we need to train these workers to ensure that they were able to still work in the very same factories that they worked in, but now in just, you know, with renewable energy. And that means consulting communities, involving, you know, labor unions to protect the workers, protect the community, protect the community's economy, and et cetera, right? And I think that's just a brilliant idea to explain democracy, or the transition to democracy. And especially as a young democracy, I'd like to believe we are a very much young democracy, and we are still in transition, that we ensure that the transition is just, right? And that will mean reparations have to be involved, right? Just like in climate change, where there's, you know, climate reparations. But for a transition to occur, a lot needs to go into it. There needs to be education and awareness raising. There needs to be finance for that. There needs to be adaptation for that, to ensure that as we move along and trying to define this democracy, that we do not leave anyone behind. And I feel that's exactly what happened after the anti-apartheid movement and the conference that negotiated the freedom for this country, and also the leaders, is that once they were within the negotiation rooms, a lot of people were left behind, right? And some people haven't been able to catch up. And that's what exactly now we're doing, is playing catch-ups. And those catch-ups even go as far as understanding the Constitution. And the people that obviously, wrote it and where we were coming from, and saying, hey, is there ways that we can amend the Constitution or change it up? Especially when we start having conversations that, like for example, the recommendations from the Zondo report when it comes to electoral reform. One of the Zondo's recommendations is that we elect a president directly. And the president then responded by saying, there'll be a lot of political changes, changing the Constitution, changing this, changing that, changing that. And maybe that's what it requires, right? It requires changing a lot of things. And I think we shouldn't be scared of doing that. We shouldn't be scared of ensuring that the transition is just and that everyone is part of it. In the beginning, Suzanne spoke about this, rainbow and it's like we were sold this rainbow idea, and then it was just like, yeah, we are Rainbow Nation, and nothing was done after that. But in order to ensure that everyone gets on board with what's currently happening in South Africa, it will require for us to address a lot of things, and sometimes maybe switch up the Constitution, or change the laws that govern us, or elect different parties, or maybe call for independent candidates, or call for like independence and etc. And I hope that answers your question really on transitioning democracies, especially young democracies. And also another thing, I hope we do not shy away as a country and as young people to learn from what other countries have been doing. And in that is recognizing, for example, the electoral amendment bill that's currently in the NCOP. No other country has it in the world. It's not happening anywhere. So what does that tell you? Do we want to start something new? Or is it like, no, maybe we should, step back and go back to the drawing table and having new models? I think we shouldn't also back away from learning from other countries as a young democracy, but most importantly, to ensure that everyone gets on board and that the transition to this idea of a democracy we want in South Africa involves everyone. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Eliwe. Sam, do you want to come in? Do you have any thoughts from Kama's question?
Yeah, sure. I think it's multi-layered. I don't see a one-size-fits-all solution for the challenge. But I think just to expand a little bit around it, the question of the electoral system and reform, possible reform, I think, the question then would be the how. Because as it stands, the reality of the matter is that we are represented by, well, let's start there. Our system is politicized. It's comprised of political parties or formations that claim to receive a mandate from an overwhelming majority, when we know that that's not the case. And there are, questions around perhaps, having a constituency-based system instead. And now, as mentioned, the possibility of independent candidates running. But how, I think in a practical system that would happen is something we'd have to think about. How does a non-funded or non-well-funded independent candidate from a local community contest with a well-funded political formation that has been, that has existed and operated and has somewhat of, organizational muscle and memory and knowledge. how do they compete successfully and go on then to represent constituents within their local community and govern and serve them. So I think the system is something we'd have to think about, how we reform it, so that it is more, Afrocentric inclined, it's more collective in its orientation, and not, individual based. Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a critical question. And for me, that's where citizens, social movements come to the fore. I mean, could we have, for example, a fees must fall or a roads must fall moment in a much more broader, context? Could we see that from our citizens, in years to come, citizens who say, because it is correct, the notion that, citizens who don't vote are taking a politically inclined and conscious decision is, in my personal view, absolutely correct. It is a myth that people don't vote because they're not politically inclined or educated. It is a demonstration, of a political activism, form of activism or social activism. But I think that then begs the question as to, could we see that on a much larger scale? Could we see some of the social movement work we've seen from, for example, our students of institutions of higher learning be replicated in our broader local communities across provinces, and I think that also requires us, as young people in particular, to take up space, women as well, to take up space, as our former Miss SA said, in different areas of work. I think one of the mistakes in reflection is that often as young people involved in politics, be it on campuses, be it elsewhere, the move always is, how do I get into council? How do I get into a legislature? How do I get into parliament so that I can come on, a platform like Twitter and say, I'm the youngest, I'm the first and the youngest. And in as much as that might be important, in terms of representation, having young people represented, in our legislative houses now, because that is the system we have right now. In as much as that is important, we do understand the power dynamics within those same institutions and the reality that even those young voices still get erased within the space and aren't necessarily able and empowered to represent our interests in parliament or in council. How do we get then us as young people, women, and so on, into different spaces to activate the kind of reform that we want to see? Thanks, Ola.
Thank you, Sam. All right, I see Ususani just came back. I'm hoping, Guti, you are all sorted in terms of your load shedding. Susani, can you indicate if you are able to jump in, and still answering that question, by the way? Susani? All right, okay. Colleagues, please, okay, I see Susandi is just coming in. Colleagues, please feel free to send questions, comments on speakers' presentations. Sorry, Susandi, you may go. I think we just lost Susandi again. Oh, okay, she's back. Susandi, can you hear us? Sandy? Okay, not. All right. If there aren't any more questions, maybe we can move closer to just the speakers sharing their concluding remarks. Okay, just before that, there's one more question from Annelisa Patso. She says, under the understanding that accountability is a huge factor in the functionality of a democratic government, what characterizes citizenry in a democratic state? Sam, do you want to go first? Do you have any thoughts on that question before we go over to your concluding remarks?
No, I'll just wait till, my concluding remarks. I'll expand a bit more.
All right, okay. Veliwe, do you want to jump in regarding that question before we go over to our concluding remarks?
I think we can move towards concluding remarks, and I could add it there.
All right, perfect. All right, so Sandy, can we also do the same with you? I'm just going to check on you on the side private here as well. If you're back audio-wise, is your network connection fine now?
Yeah, this is a reflection of the post-1994 democratic process, because really the quality of life is really compromised. And I'm at a venue now where I'm supposed to have connectivity, but anyway, here we are. I regret that I've missed much of the Q&A. I don't know if you'd be kind enough, Zola, to perhaps, direct some questions that were sent to me, or if you would rather prefer that I just do a brief concluding remark. I don't know.
Yes, can we do it this way? I'll give each speaker 10 minutes for concluding remarks, and then perhaps you can also incorporate some of the answers, some of your answers to the questions in your concluding remarks. Maybe I'll just read them out again for the last time for the benefit of Mrs. Sandy. And there's actually one more that just came through as well. So Annelisa asked, so under the understanding that accountability is a huge factor in the functionality of a democratic government, what characterizes citizenry in a democratic state? And then Rodney asked, how can we make sure that public representatives prioritize service delivery rather than party loyalty? Because they were in fact chosen to deliver services. I think this also relates to what Usam mentioned in her presentation earlier. So, Sandy, I don't know if you want to go first. For now, Kuba, you still have connection. I don't want us to lose you.
Perhaps I should go first, Zola. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank
Great.
you so much.
Question by
Sorry,
so let me read the question
again. We cannot hear you, Gabushe.
Zola.
Okay, Suzanne, can I ask that we give another speaker whilst I just chat to you on the side and just find out how we can make the connection better, because we can't hear you. The line keeps breaking.
Okay.
All right, Sister Anyway, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Zola. So I think just to answer the two questions, one that just asked about the characteristics of citizenry and how can we ensure greater accountability when it comes to service delivery. And I think the answer is pretty quite simple. well, not simple, complex, but from my side, I think it would be for all of us in this room after this session to read up on the electoral amendment bill and the number of articles that have came out from, civil society and business and some, thought leaders that we have. And I think I just want to reflect on, my 9-to-5 job and the job we're currently doing at the Defender of Democracy. It's around ensuring that the 2024 elections are protected, right? And saying to political parties, or rather actually to MPs, that people deserve good ethical leaders, right? This is something we touched on the Conference for Democratic Renewal and Change. And it's something, again, we touched on when we had the electoral indaba, is to say what makes up a good leader, right? And these are questions that all South Africans must ask themselves and must answer by being in support of the president not signing the electoral bill and the NCOP rejecting the electoral amendment bill. We saw, the voting that happened in Parliament last week, and MPs attacking civil society. A country is as strong as its civil society. And we know it's not the first time that political parties throw jabs at civil societies. We saw it with the AIDS, when the AIDS pandemic came up to be under the former, President Becky's administration, when civil society was attacked and they were told that, we were asked questions about who's funding you, is it some Western influence, and et cetera, and et cetera. And again, civil society again was trash talk in Parliament, just for trying to protect the vote of the people and trying to say, do not steal my vote. And I think that's, at the moment, I think that's just could be the possible answer to this equation, is for people to be able to vote for their public representatives so that they could have the power to recall because right now as it stands, if I could say, write a letter to your MP, anyone who's in the call, write a letter to your MP and ask your MP to explain to you what the electoral amendment bill is. Most of the people in this call do not know their MPs, and don't fall stressed by that. I also don't know who my MP is. But and that's exactly what we mean, is because in local government, when you know your councillor, you are able to go to your councillor and say, hey, this and this and this is happening. So at the moment, political parties are so invested with themselves in themselves. We saw MPs coming out in literally the middle of, heightened load shedding and water shedding in Johannesburg, saying that there's certain perks that they want. I think we must get rid of that mentality and start creating leaders that are accountable and transparent. And it would really, I think, in my conclusion, would really urge everyone to read up on the bill, read up what civil society is saying. We've written countless letters to the NCOP and to to the National Assembly as well. And now we are going to be having a march to the union buildings to urge the president not to sign this bill and put the 2024 elections in jeopardy. And it's not just the 2024 elections, it's also 2029 elections. People deserve leaders that they can know their names and leaders that will listen to their constituency. As I close, I think it's very important, and this is just in my personal capacity, that we have a caring, a caring country, a country that cares about its people, leaders that listen to its constituency, and more importantly, a people that have hope in their government, a people that trust their government and trust that the institutions, their democratic institutions, are set out to protect them and serve them. I think that's very much important. And if all of that is in check, I promise you, our citizens will be more than, they'll start being active again in politics. in shaping democracy rather. And I really do hope that, you know, the weaknesses that, because I think it's another conversation again that you guys might have on there, is speaking about the threats to democracy and the weaknesses to democracy, and seeing who are those people that sit there and think, what could I do with this chaos? And we saw that with the July unrest, obviously hoping that never happens again. But we're seeing a series of articles coming out saying, South Africa could be heading to becoming a mafia state. We saw, you know, the construction mafias in the KZN. Also saw with Operation Tutula. When there are no good leaders or leaders that are accountable, there is that there are people that are going to emerge to try and take advantage of the weakness that is happening and go and talk to the people because our MPs don't want to go to their constituency and listen to them. There are people that are going to come there in the guise of listening to the people. And I think that's what we should try and make sure that doesn't happen. And in order to do that, it is very much important that we have leaders that are going to listen. I think that's very important. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beliwe. I'm going to ask Sam to share her concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Zola. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, just in terms of the discussion and some of the inputs, yeah, we are constantly in transition, and that means that, you know, change, in my personal view, is inevitable. As to the when and the how, I think, that is for us to either observe in terms of, you know, those citizens, or with respect to those citizens who are not necessarily actively involved, or if not observe, then up to us to shape and inform. And I think there are a number of ways that we can do that. I think, as mentioned by Usis Celiwe, you know, it's important for us as citizens to, you know, make remarks, to give inputs about some of the laws that are being passed, in our country, irrespective of where. It could be in your local municipality, it could be in your provincial legislature, here in Bishu in the Eastern Cape, it could be in Parliament, you know, to understand the bills that are being take note of and understand the bills that are being presented before the NCOP and then Parliament, because those laws essentially regulate us, they regulate our behavior. To oversight, you know, how many times do we travel home and see another, for example, piece of infrastructure totally dilapidated, and not raise it, you know, with our respective elected public representative. So those are some of the practical things we can do. Of course, political education, discourse, activating safe spaces, for, in particular, the marginalized, to mobilize, to broaden consciousness, to contribute to shaping, you know, the reform we want to see is so important. And I say that because I think even as, you know, students and staff of institutions of higher learning, we, and again, I'll put it in quotation marks, we have somewhat of a privilege to access safe spaces such as the one that's been created today. That, you know, our fellow brothers and sisters in our fellow local communities don't necessarily have access to, but do need that access, do have to have the space and time to equally participate in shaping this reform that we talk about. And then, of course, the ballot box, colleagues. for those who do vote, it's to consider your decision. We've seen, for example, in Lesotho just this month, how a new party has just formed a national coalition, the Revolution for Prosperity organization, and we'll see how that goes. We've seen in Ghana how the ruling party won its last election with just one seat, and so that is, I think, another way change with respect to the current system we have. We're having a discussion about how we reform today in this discussion, in this space, but in terms of the current existing electoral system we have, we see a shift. We are starting to see a shift amongst voters who do participate in elections, be it by voting or staying away on election day. We see it with the rise in the number of hung municipalities we have now across the country between 2016 and 2021. I think we have a 40-odd additional number of hung municipalities that depend on coalitions to compromise and try their best. I'm not sure if it's quite working out. We'll have to keep observing. But compromise and try and establish, common interests in favor of the people, and servicing the people. And then just lastly, I think just around the question, the important question Rodney raised about how public reps get held accountable. Well, the reality is that I think that accountability has to come from us as citizens. And I say that because, and I will speak openly and frankly to say that within party political ranks, and I'm sure Rodney will know this as well, the reality is that public representatives at the end of the day have to toe the party line. So whatever the mandate is from the senior leadership of whichever political party we're talking about is, even if it is in contrary to or contradiction to, your individual convictions about, how society needs to be transformed, made more fair and more just, the reality is that at the end of the day, you, in that capacity as a party political rep, have to toe the line and represent and communicate the mandate, the ideology, the policy of that party. And sometimes that is in total contradiction to your own convictions as an individual who might be a bit more politically conscious about the realities on the ground. If you are one of the good moral public reps, and we still do have some of those across party political lines, so it might be in contradiction to some of your own personal convictions, but it certainly is in contradiction to what citizens need and are starting to demand in their local communities from public reps. And I think that's the spirit that needs to continue to be fostered, to have citizens hold their local government councillors fully accountable for basic service delivery, for some of the policy decisions that are taken, and some of the just, as mentioned before, bad state of affairs and how it affects everyday reality in society. So it really is up to us, because we know that within party political system, internally, unless there is a form of discipline within an organization, I think that discipline and the accountability therefore has to come from us outside of those political entities. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm hoping we have Sandy. Sandy, can you please indicate if your connection has improved in any way?
I am keeping my fingers crossed. Can you hear me, Zola?
Perfectly audible. Thank you.
All right. Perhaps I want to then start with the question that was raised by, I think, Rodney. And I think it's in line with the observation that was made by Frantz Fanon in terms of the, how the ruling class is incapable of learning from itself, or just generally how, the current South African government is incapable of learning from its own history. South Africa, being the last nation to be, independent, should have taken serious lessons, from the rest of Africa in terms of how to handle this quote unquote democratic transition. I want to then bring the example of, and this is an example that should be known in public discourse, the example of Burkina Faso and the Thomas Sankara model of, governance or democracy, wherein Thomas Sankara, upon assuming power, ensured that public servants are not inserted above the people that they serve. In actual fact, the problem in South Africa is that, the people who are meant to serve us, the people who are supposed to be our servants, are actually the ones who are, doing the opposite of what servants should be doing. Thomas Sankara was able, for example, to say that, people who hold office should not be given more access to resources than the people they serve, in such a way that you would not find in Burkina Faso then a prime minister or a minister of any stature, driving in a motorcade or driving fancy cars. He actually, made it a law that all public servants should drive, small cars, and sold all the German cars that the previous government was using. So he did that, to indicate that he was about a program that was intended to liberate, people. And he understood what coloniality had done in the minds of the people in terms of how they even imagine freedom or liberation. This is something that the South African government, or particularly the ANC, as the liberation movement that took over from the apartheid regime, should have considered and should have taken seriously. In South Africa, 28 years into the so-called democratic dispensation, there is no national program that educates Black people in particular who are the victims of apartheid, coloniality, and racism. There's no educational program at a national level that educates us on coloniality. As such, even when we experience coloniality, we have, we have found liberal ways of, identifying it instead of calling it out as it is. And this is engineered within the educational system and across, public discourse, including the media. So when you talk about how can we then help South Africans to have, the public servants that they deserve, the public servants that are able to deliver the services, I think the answer again lies in the compromise that was made in 1994. My colleague spoke about, state capture. And for us in the Black consciousness and Pan-Africanist movement, state capture exists in the 1994 amendment. It was engineered in that particular transition or the compromise, whereby, the liberation of the freedom, what some people call democracy, was negotiated from a position of compromise, with the liberation movement being in a position of dispowerment. And so in actual fact, the gains that people put into building, the gains that people put, and I'm talking about the masses now, the gains that went into liberating South Africa were then compromised and sacrificed at the altar of, big business in collusion with the African Nationalist Congress. And the second question, I don't remember what it was, but I know it's on the chart. But perhaps I should speak to the question of, both Sam and my sister, I forget her name, keep invoking this idea of, active citizenship and participation of, the citizens in trying to give content and direction in this democratic contest. I think, a critical reading of that, kind of involvement or participation will also let people know how, for example, from the from the early 1990s, right up until, the early 2000s, Black people particularly have been challenging, the government. They've been taking active participation in trying to not only air their views, but in trying to say that, something is not right. And if you think about the question of change and continuity in terms of how the state has responded, to these people, in terms of how the state has continued to silence the voices that come from, the public, to challenge its limitations in terms of driving the democratic program, you would then begin to see that movements like Abahlali Basemjondolo have been mowed down with bullets. The response of the democratic, government is similar to the response of the apartheid regime, whereby people are responded to with violence. We also know the story of Andries Tatane, who was shot public view by the South African police, the same police that are supposed to be serving or representing a democratic dispensation. Of course, we know about what happened to the people, the miners in Marikana. And somehow, even after that, we keep on, saying or telling people that people need to take, especially young people, we keep on saying they should take up, they should commit themselves to being active citizens and participate in changing, their realities, forgetting that, we have a history whereby such advances have been met with nothing but violence. Even the fees must fall students, some of them are still serving their sentences today. Some of them are even, in parole. Students are not allowed to interact and just to go about living their lives. And so when we talk about the question of, citizenry or active engagement of the citizen, we need to also bring, those historical facts into consideration. There's a quote that was made famous by Khalid Mohammed, and he says that he who gives you the diameter of your knowledge prescribes the circumference of your activities. I think if we talk in the context of post-1994 South Africa and the democratization that was given birth in a moment of compromise, we need to understand that everything else that we might want to try on or attempt to advance, a more progressive form of existence is prescribed or determined by the compromise that was made in 1994. And therefore, I don't think after 28 years, we should deny this. In fact, it's a bit dishonest to deny that the democratic program has failed. Our lives are deteriorating at various levels, including education, even in the socio-economic sphere. And it's quite interesting that 28 years later, we still want to advance the idea that the ballot box is somewhat a solution, because we have seen, I think, in the moment of 1994, when certain liberation movements outside the ANC refused to enter into those negotiations, I think those movements were telling us what we're experiencing today. And that is the fact that, the ballot box, you cannot fit Black demands into the ballot box. And you can see this in how Black dispossession, particularly on the land question, is still legalized. The Constitution is dispossessing Black people legally. And these are things that, you would think would be changed when we enter into a democratic dispossession, but they've remained the same. I think I will pause there, and thank you so much, Zola.
Thank you so much, Sis Sandy, and to all our speakers, actually, Sister Liwe and Sam, for sharing their concluding remarks. Just to quickly mention, Sister Liwe has to jump into another session, so can we please excuse her? Sister Liwe, you are free to leave whenever you have to jump. So I'm just going to quickly read some of the responses that were shared on the channel as well. So Unensi said, well done for a great panel with three strong, knowledgeable ladies We must always endeavor to give women space to share their knowledge and wisdom. This is one of the critical ways to fight patriarchy. Thanks, Zola, for the facilitation. Thank you, Nancy. And then just to acknowledge as well the presence of Rampela. She said, I just want you to know how proud I am to see you as the generation that is most educated, skilled, and connected, leading the charge in critiquing our inadequate democracy and engaging in what you can bring to rising to your leadership responsibilities. I would suggest you use this circle of conversations to create a network of networks with each other in an exponential way to engage all of you to share ideas about how you can shape the future you desire. You are the majority, but use it strategically to challenge resistance to a more participatory, direct, representative democracy that can affect a just socio-economic system that restores Ubuntu. It is in your hands, but my generation has many members that are ready to support you in an intergenerational coalition of citizens for social justice. Phambili, Mampela. Thank you so much for your comments. We are nearing the end with only just 15 minutes left. If you, to the audience, if you do still have any responses that you'd like to share, you're more than welcome to share to all those that are connected via our YouTube or Facebook. You're still more than welcome to share, and on the chat section as well. But for now, I'd like to really thank you each and everyone for joining today. And I'm now going to hand over to Sianda Andres to just give us a closing and a vote of thanks.
Greetings, everyone. Am I audible, Zola?
You're perfectly audible, kind sir.
Thank you very much. Greetings, colleagues. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much to our panelists, including our facilitator, for agreeing to be part of this fruitful event. We really appreciate the time and engagement that you guys have given us. So on behalf of Gus and Konrad, mine is to say thank you very much to the audience as well for taking your time in these busy days of the month to come and listen and also engage with us with the knowledge and empowering thought-provoking inputs that you have given us. Thank you very much also to the team from CAS and from Konrad for pulling up with the logistics in terms of organizing this event. This was indeed one of the best ones we've had. The knowledge was shared, and as the comments said, that we wish that this could be an ongoing conversations to build up to become one of the generations that is going to contribute to the development of our country into a better tomorrow, even if it's not for us today, but tomorrow for the generation that follows under us, just like we did on Fast Fall. That is partly helpful to the younger generation, as a lot of things have changed and they are enjoying the fruits of our sweats when we were shot by the police during the Christmas Fall strike, trying to fight for free education and also a decolonized education. So with all that being said, I would like to thank you very much again, guys. I wish everyone could enjoy their day, as this is our last dialogue for this year of 2022. We thank you very much for this help, and also enjoy your holidays throughout the year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sianda. Yes, indeed. This has really been a fruitful conversation. We've had very interesting views from all of our speakers and nice questions that came from our audience. So maybe just to, sorry, okay, Rodney, I see your hand is up.
No, I was just applauding. not my hand.
Right.
So I'm agreeing with everything
all
you
right,
have said.
all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, so yeah, absolutely. It has really been a fruitful conversation. Again, I must actually applaud Gus and Konrad for such a progressive approach in terms of even selecting the panel of speakers. I see it was 3 women, which is really lovely. I was so excited to actually see that. So thank you so much again for joining. We have come to the end of the session today. And yeah, may everyone have a good day further. Please do continue to engage in such conversations. I think as all I hope that we use such spaces as well, even outside these conversations. We just continue to create networks where we're actually able not only to just speak on these things, these important conversations, but to also go out there and implement, some of the things that we discuss. And yeah, just continue to create, not only for us, but again, as Sam also mentioned earlier, to be able to collect everything that is done and just be able to relay it to not only the young people, but to like even the person that's probably in the deep rural areas without any form of access to, I don't know, the news, because there's no TV, or with just like limit anything that may limit them in terms of just getting access, in terms of what's happening, in terms of communication. So I'd just like to encourage all of us to, continue to do that. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining. And I hope you all have a good day further.
Thank you.
Thank you.